Hello, how's your day going? Mine's great, because I've got my friend here, Jacques Morrell, co-conspirator in Psycho Killer, shocking true crime podcasts. And he's going to be talking to me about some of his experiences over a police career spanning, 30 years?
The full 30.
The full 30, must be, you get your pension. That's how it goes, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm proud to say still at the relative sharp end, on the 30th year. I wasn't tucked away in some back office. So yeah, I'm quite pleased about that, because that's how policing grabbed me and kept me for 30 years.
Today we're going to be talking about a subject that starts with some abbreviations and acronyms. Policing is full of abbreviations and acronyms. If you're a listener to Psycho Killer, you'll probably be familiar with the VICAP, which is an American acronym, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, something the FBI runs in the United States. But we're back here in the old country, and we're going to be talking first of all about NAFIS. I think that's how it's pronounced. Is it NAFIS? And then Ident 1. Would you say NAFIS or NAFIS? I don't know.
I don't think it really matters.
So what is NAFIS, and why is it relevant to our conversation today? Why is it relevant to this episode of the Detectives Files True Crime Tales with Jacques Morrell?
Yeah, I've just written down here, actually, I put Fingerprints, a forgotten crime solver, which is obviously not true, but obviously with DNA and other evidence, digital forensic evidence and all this that's now convicting people, I think it's worth reminding ourselves, really, and it goes back to when the late 80s, when I was learning the job of policing, that fingerprints were almost all we had. Hopefully a confession every now and then, but there wasn't a lot to go on in that detective's toolkit. So, yeah, I thought we could talk about that. But yeah, NAFIS, National Automated Fingerprint Identification Service. But yeah, a digitalized form. Now let's think how computers and the web came in the 90s. Think about all that big shift in how we stored data and shared data and used data. Because going back to the mid-80s when I joined the job, almost all of these things were paper systems, cards in files that you pulled out alphabetically, indexed information.
We saw the pitfalls of that with the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry, and how Millgarth Police Station dedicated an entire floor to the Ripper inquiry, and they then had to evacuate the floor beneath so they could use pit props to hold up the floor with the information on it, because there's so much weight.
Yeah.
It was in danger of collapse. Yeah. So much paper. Yeah.
But with this, if people can sort of think back to those days, you've got these metal cabinets with index cards and various whatever category you want it to be put in, and you had to physically go and retrieve one of these cards. In theory, you should never have removed it from the office because it was the only form of that information, but you could then copy it or take notes from it and return it. It was that laborious, but it worked to a point. And fingerprints, the whole process of dealing with fingerprints from crime scenes and hopefully connecting with a suspect, was very much a paper feed of documents produced by the crime scene investigators, CSIs, scenes of crimes officers, SOCO, all these different terminologies. So yeah, I thought it would be good to talk about that. And I mean, during my service as well, and then when NAFIS came in, I think it was 1998 it first started and really came into play in the early noughties. It then migrated into an even more efficient computerized system called Ident One. I think that was probably the mid noughties when they spent a shed load of money on some American all singing, all dancing database in order to record fingerprints and identify people as well. Because the other thing as well I remember, Simon, is that in the old days, somebody could be a convicted individual, be arrested and give another name and start again. It rarely happened, but sometimes they did. Eventually things would catch up with them. But obviously with a computerized fingerprint identification system, you can get them to put it on a scanner as they get booked in, and it will confirm who they are.
That's something that's changed, isn't it? Because I remember back in the day, fingerprints were taken with an ink pad. You see this happen in the movies the whole time. But now it's done electronically, isn't it? It's done with something that's, well, as you say, it's an electronic scanner. So you get a digital photograph of the fingerprint. And all of that is portable too now, isn't it? You don't have to go to a police station necessarily to have your fingerprints taken.
That's exactly right. And it can be used by various agencies as well in terms of identifying. So it's got a lot better and a lot more efficient and used for more purposes other than used for identification purposes of an individual rather than just solving a crime.
Let's go back to the mid-80s then, when you started on the job. Just describe the process then for investigating a burglary. This is something close to my heart because I was burgled when I was living in London. And my main memory of that is the mess that was left, not just by the people who'd turned the flat over, but by Socco, because they were dusting the whole place with fingerprint powder, which is basically very fine powdered aluminium, isn't it? I had to do it, but in a way that created more of a mess that was harder to clear up than just putting things back together after a couple of burglars had been rooting through my chest of drawers.
Well, that's true, and it might have been hours, in fact, it might have been a day or so before that fingerprint officer or crime scene investigator came to the flat. So you're sitting waiting for being told not to touch anything. Yeah, that's a good example. I mean, that's how it happened. You would, in most cases, a uniformed officer would go to the first report of a burglary. There would then be, incredibly in those days, a follow-up visit from a detective in most cases. An assessment would be made of what was there, and scenes of crime would be booked. Now, once the scenes of crime officer had been, and they travel around, they tend to cover specific areas, but so you'd get to know the individuals themselves. And once they'd been on their list of burglaries to go to, sometimes they would call in at the police station to the CID office, or sometimes they would just go back to headquarters where they worked from and complete the process. If they'd found a mark on a broken window or something like that they thought was interesting, they would tend to ring the officer up fairly quickly, or even call in and speak to them. Said, we've found a mark, looks like a palm print or an index finger. We might have some progress on this one, because let's remember that most career burglars, would wear gloves. So fingerprints were by no means a guaranteed line of investigation, but it had to be covered, So going back to your flat, you had to leave everything where it was until the scenes of crime had been. They had to systematically go round to try and find marks that could be attributed to the suspect. It had to be done because occasionally it bore fruit and it brought us dividends. Majority of times it didn't, but it didn't stop us from using that because there wasn't the other option with DNA, or there wasn't cameras wired up everywhere that will give you a full description of the offender.
Yeah, in my case, the offenders were wearing gloves, so they didn't find any fingerprints, but they had to do it anyway. They had to go through the motions, follow the process.
Sure. Yeah, that's it. So, I mean, the magic word for the investigators, for the detectives, was when you got a piece of paper through saying, we've been to that burglary at Simon's flat, we've found a palm print on the window, that's been eliminated as not from the householder or anyone with lawful access, and we're ready to go. So what did we do then? Well, what we did, we either knew who were the active burglars in the area, so we'd submit a list of names of the burglars we believe were active for them to manually compare with this palm print. And we might have to do a little bit of research with those card index systems, with the Intelligence Bureau, who might have information about a burglar from London who's just been checked walking around the streets of any town. We might put that name forward. So it's all, you get the idea how sort of laborious and manual it is, and it depends on who comes up with the names of suggested names to compare.
And if Detective Constable Bloggs has taken one of those cards, popped it in their briefcase and forgotten to return it to the card index, that burglar's disappeared.
Yeah, the system's gone. Exactly. So all this automated thing, how quick and national and covering all the bases it is incredible. If you look back to that system where it relied on somebody suggesting a name so that the fingerprint officer could physically compare the two marks, which actually makes the whole thing quite exciting, doesn't it? You imagine that moment when they do physically see it. They're looking through a magnifying glass at a document on in front of them on the desk. It's a magical moment, but it took time, and obviously this current system is far ahead of that.
Yeah, that's real Sherlock Holmes stuff, isn't it? It makes you wonder how reliable the evidence was if it relied on one person with expertise visually scrutinising through a magnifying glass the fingerprints and making comparisons. It worked though, didn't it?
Sure, it did work, and I forget the number of ridge details that they had to have to make it sufficiently identifiable, and it would have then a second process of checking it. But yeah, that first moment when you saw these unique features that we all have, it's an amazing. It's an amazing piece of crime solving. But as a detective, when you got an identification, what you also wanted was, there's 4 letters, GEFC. If it said against the suspect identified, GEFC, good enough for court. And that was your golden ticket. So you could bring them in, and not only could you interview them and deal with them, if they said nothing, the mark was good enough for court, and you could charge them on the strength of that identification.
So you've got the fingerprint officer with the magnifying glass. You've got GEFC, good enough for court. What happens then? Any cases that spring out, from that magic moment when you go, aha, right, we can pull them in now and we can charge them with a crime?
Yeah, yes, there was, and I think it was probably around 1990, because I can visualise where I was working. In fact, I'd been abstracted to a coordinated investigation into a spate of crime, well, more than a spate, an absolute tidal wave of crime, where women in cars were on the commute in the morning to the office, were pulling up at a traffic light, and a figure would emerge from the estate, smash the passenger window before they'd even realised what has happened, And of course, what do women going to work have on the passenger seat? Their handbag. So before they even realised what had happened, the handbag was gone, and the offender was back into the estate. What would have been in the handbag? Maybe some cash, almost certainly a checkbook. Remember those?
Back in the day.
A checkbook and a cheque guarantee card. Quite a valuable commodity in the right hands, but obviously you'd have to have a female to go out with the checkbook and card and make good use of it, and that's
To masquerade as the legitimate owner of the cheques and the guarantee card.
correct.
Right.
And that's what was happening. But and it was it really, on the scale of this, it needed sorting, not just the thieves in the first place, but the follow-up cheque kiting, as we called it, where all these cheques were being spent regionally. And what it required was an individual to drive the woman to supermarkets, and they would spend up to £50, which was the limit. So they'd spend £49.99. What would they spend it on? Booze, cigarettes, items that could be easily sold in the pubs. It's quite straightforward, isn't it? And these were all following a theme, and we were on to certain people and this, that, and the other. And then I got the phone call from a fingerprint officer. He said, "I've got an ident for you on a couple of cheques that have been used in this way, but there's something different about it." So I said, "Okay, I'll come and see you." And what amazed me was this moment for a fingerprint officer when they see that ident. He'd looked at the marks on the cheque, which have to be chemically examined, as you've said about the offence at your flat. There's a chemical called ninhydrin, I think, or something like that they have to treat these cheques with, and it reveals a fingerprint. And he'd seen this thumbprint that he remembered he'd seen it before, in so much as it had an unusual middle section or unusual swirl, which amazed me. It's like it was just something, because he's seeing them all day, every day. He said, "I've seen this mark before. It's so unusual."
That's incredible knowledge, isn't it?
Yeah.
That experience, golly.
And he'd then gone and sort of gone back through his own workload to find the same one. And he found him, but it wasn't the standard offender on there. It was a male using cheques that were actually in a ambiguous name, could be male or female. But he'd not been spending these cheques in supermarkets for £50 worth of booze. He'd bought a pair of shoes for £15 at a shop in a nearby town. He'd bought something else quite innocuous. So it was very unusual. So I said, "Well, okay, so who is this male that's been using these cheques?" So we looked into him, and he was a man with no convictions, but he'd received a caution for, I think it was some kind of domestic incident, either damage or maybe a minor assault. But he'd received a caution fairly recently, hence the fingerprint officer recognised his thumbprint. And so it was completely different. We brought the guy in, and what had happened was that his girlfriend, who lived on this estate, had just moved into this estate where these thefts were taking place, was being pressured by the criminal gang to work for them. She'd resisted, and he'd resisted, but they were getting intimidation. So reluctantly, they'd agreed to take a checkbook with the card and to go out and make some money from it. Obviously, he'd not done a good job, because he'd not brought back the proceeds that they were expecting. So it all went sour, and they ended up moving away. So when we knock on his door, he tells us all, because it's a moment in his life that he regretted. He was under considerable pressure by this gang, and was willing to explain what he'd done. But it was all down. The reason we caught him was purely on that fingerprint officer's fantastic memory.
That's incredible. And what happened to the guy who was passing the fraudulent checks? Did he go to prison?
He didn't go to prison. He was charged, and he got some lower sentence.
Did he give evidence against the OCG, against the gang that had set him up?
He would have done. It's a side issue. There was a lot of complications with trying to get the main players before the court. You can imagine this was the pub where all these checks were going through, it was known on the estate that there was a card school at this pub, but not 52 pack of playing cards. It was check cards that were. Yeah, it was a big conspiracy. There was lots of stuff going off, but yeah, that's just something that really stood out.
Did you get any of the main players in the end?
Yes, to a point. Yeah, picking them off sort of as and when. Yeah, it was certainly the offending was disrupted, and to a point that it went away.
And this is all through one fingerprint officer with vast experience and what sounds like a photographic memory.
Yeah.
And one guy who wanted to make a clean breast of it because he'd been set up.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
That's the breakthrough you're looking for. Another case where, well, I know that familial DNA played a big part in bringing the offender to justice, because we've covered that in an earlier episode of our podcast. But that was the murder of Colette Aram, which I think you were, if you weren't SIO, you were certainly very closely involved in that, and also in bringing Paul Hutchinson, Colette's murderer, to book.
Yes, yeah, an amazing case in a lot of ways. Poor Colette was 16 in 1983 when she was abducted, sexually assaulted, and left to die in a field near to where she lived. And the crime, it was one of the first on Crime Watch that was solved. It was one of the first for a conviction with familial DNA, so people can go back and have a listen to our episode on it. But the key thing is that in the 20-odd years that it was unsolved, there was another facet to the investigation, is that your journalist colleagues at the local newspaper, shortly after the murder, received an anonymous letter that claimed to be from the killer, that gave some comment to say that you'll never find me, I'll go away soon, she was alive when I left her, this kind of thing. And that letter was treated very seriously, was obviously preserved. Any fingerprints on it, and there might be a news or somebody in the mailroom at the newspaper, they're all eliminated, but there was one mark that was not eliminated that was clearly of interest. However, the experts that looked at this letter felt it was more than likely a hoax, because all the information in the letter was generally known to the public at the time. There's nothing significant that piqued everyone's interest. So it was sat there sort of in the background. When Paul Hutchinson was identified through familial DNA in his family and was brought in, we were working on getting the DNA sample up to Chorley in Lancashire, I think, from Nottingham in the Midlands, which takes a lot longer than getting his fingerprints to the police headquarters where the fingerprints are. So whilst his DNA was being sent rapidly up to Chorley in Lancashire, his fingerprint goes to the police headquarters within 20 minutes. And I think you're even guessing what's going to come back now. What came back first was the fingerprint check. And what did the fingerprint tell us? It was on the letter. And that was another milestone moment for us. We knew we'd got the right individual. We knew it was all down to DNA that had caught him. And yet, that fingerprint from 26 years before, on a letter that was goading the police, that was adding even more misery to the case, as bad as it was, that was treated as a hoax, or believed almost certainly a hoax, wasn't. And that was the first identification that came back before the DNA, which was also positive.
So, first data point, fingerprint. Second data point, DNA, result, conviction. You can't walk away from that, can you?
You can't walk away from that, no. And I think, again, that was going back, so that fingerprint was obtained 83? Would have been, yeah. So that fingerprint was in that fingerprint office when I first joined the job. It was sat there, and then 20 plus years later, it's still there waiting to be matched with the offender, and we were part of that. So,
Paul Hutchinson, beware your sins will find you out.
Will find you out.
Yeah.
So, fingerprints, a forgotten crime solver. What a fantastic tool for solving crime.
So next time, what do you fancy talking about? I know you've got several things up your sleeve, so to speak. What do you fancy for the next Detectives Files, your next true crime tale?
Yeah, well, if people don't come forward and suggest something, which would be nice, yeah, we can perhaps talk about...
You're asking for witnesses to come forward, yeah?
Yeah, witnesses to come forward, yeah. What are people interested in terms of policing? Maybe we can fit something in.
It'd be great to hear from you. Yeah, just go ahead, drop us a line. You can do it on our socials, you can do it through the website, psycho-killer.co. That's how people tend to get in touch with us. Always great to hear from you, by the way, and we do reply to emails when we get them. Some thoughts
I've got. Parochial policing, how parochial policing was when I first started, whereas now we have more structured squads and departments dealing with specific crimes. We were more parochial then, parochial meaning sort of work to a small area, which made it a little more partisan. It's all the P's, parochial, partisan, policing. Maybe public order. We could look at all that.
4 P's, I like that. Jacques Morrell, the man I call the governor, thanks so much for sharing your stories and your experience with us. Your Detectives Files True Crime Tales with Jacques Morrell on Psycho Killer, shocking true crime podcasts.